All right, everyone. So let's talk about the most recent war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And let's bring up Israel. Let's talk about Israel. I know they are evangelicals who hate any sort of criticism for Israel, but we are going to talk about this subject a little bit, okay? So bear with me here. I know it hurts. I know it hurts, but we are going to get through this because we got to get that knowledge in yo heads. So Armenia was defeated by Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan is lauding itself as having this glorious victory over their enemies, over the Armenians. And the Armenian general, Samuel Babayan, said in a recent interview that within the first 15 minutes of this war, 50% of Armenia's air defense assets and 40% of Armenia's artillery were knocked out. They were knocked out by the Azeris because Armenia is way, way behind in military technology. Armenia defeated Azerbaijan in the early 1990s, but the problem is that Armenia is still stuck in the 1990s. Israel had a lot to do with Azerbaijan's victory. We talk a lot about Turkey because Turkey is the biggest backer of Azerbaijan. That is true, but Israel also played a huge role in this. There is an article here. It is on the Armenian Mirror Spectator, and it talks about Israel's role in this war. It's really, really fascinating, and it really does reveal a lot about Israel. So it says here, it was reported that Israel not only had sold the deadly drones to the Azerbaijani army, but had also provided intelligence and surveillance of the terrain and the location of the Armenian military assets. So yes, Azerbaijan was able to knock out so much of the Armenian military's infrastructure, their air defense assets, their artillery. And yes, a lot of that had to do with Turkey's support for Azerbaijan. But also, in the same regard, a lot of this had to do with Israel. And we can also mention the Germans. The Germans also gave, I believe, Bundeswehr military trucks to the Azeris. Azerbaijan is a NATO ally, so it's being supported by NATO. So it makes sense that these NATO countries support Azerbaijan. But what's very interesting is that Israel has a little bit of a history of helping the Turks against the Armenians. There is an historical example of this, Theodore Herzl. Theodore Herzl is considered to be one of the greatest heroes in modern Jewish history. Theodore Herzl, he is considered to be the father of Zionism, and Theodore Herzl, he was looking for funding for his Zionist movement. He was looking for financing, actually. He was looking for someone to finance the initial creation of the State of Israel. This is what he was looking for. And Theodore Herzl, he had this dream that Israel would basically be a technological utopia. It would be just a state focused and fixated on technology, and it would be just one gigantic technocracy. And it would be under some sort of a technological elite. So he had this big dream about this, major technological center called Israel. And Theodore Herzl actually approached the Sultan at the time, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And he told the Sultan, I am looking for finance. I'm looking for funding for my State of Israel. And the Sultan said, I'll finance your establishment of the State of Israel, but you got to help me with something. What's that? Well, I want you to go to those Armenian militias who are resisting Ottoman rule, and I want you to convince them to put down their weapons. And so Theodore Herzl visited the leaders, some of the leadership of the Armenian resistance movement, and he told the Armenians, put down your guns, the Sultan is not going to hurt you, put down your guns. No, Mr. Sultan is your friend. And the Armenians were like, who the hell is this guy? And they didn't listen to that guy. Now, what would have happened if they listened to Theodore Herzl? They probably would have ended up dead. More than likely, they would have ended up dead, and Ottoman rule would have been further entrenched into Armenian society. So they have something of a history of supporting the Turks against the Armenians. It's very, very strange. It's very strange. You have people who, I understand, they practically worship Israel. I know worship is a very strong word. They revere Israel. They adulate Israel to a very, very high degree. But the problem with this mentality is that it basically makes Israel blameless, and it makes Israel exempt from any criticism. There is another reality, and that is people who absolutely hate Israel, and they have nothing but criticism for Israel. And these people are also in the wrong. Both of these factions, both of these sides are wrong. They are simply the opposite extremes. They are the opposite extremes, and they go against each other. But at the same time, they're both wrong. They're both wrong. One side says, oh, Israel is blameless. The other side says, oh, Israel is nothing but blame. Israel is nothing but bad. You have to have a middle ground. Israel has done some pretty bad things. Yes, you can say this pretty much about any first world country, any country that has a lot of money and is known to be, a super regional power. Israel's definitely a regional power in the Middle East. I wouldn't say it's a global power, but I would definitely say that Israel is a regional power in the Middle East. Turkey has done some pretty messed up things, much worse than Israel has ever done. And Turkey has never really admitted to any of its wrongs. The Armenian genocide, slaughtering over 1 million people. Israel, on the other side, has done some messed up things and has actually had some sort of introspection about those things to a great extent. I'll give you guys an example of that. Sabra and Shatila. Let's talk a little bit about Sabra and Shatila. Sabra and Shatila was an absolute nightmare. Basically, what happened was this, just to give you guys a little bit of a background. The Maronites and the PLO, the Palestinians, were killing each other. Maronites, for those of you who don't know, Maronites are basically the Catholics of Lebanon. So the Catholic Church is pretty big in Lebanon. There are millions of Catholics who live in Lebanon, and they are considered to be within the Maronite Catholic Church, which is the Lebanese branch of the Universal Catholic Church. So the Palestinians, who had been living in Lebanon for decades as refugees, going all the way back to when Israel defeated the Kingdom of Jordan back in the 1940s, late 1940s, and also the 6 Days War as well. And the PLO, the Palestinians, eventually, they got tired of living under an oppressive, racist system, because that's what Lebanon was. Lebanon did not allow the Palestinians to really thrive. They didn't really allow the Palestinians to get adequate work. They reduced them to, or they limited them, as far as work goes, they limited them to just working in construction sites. There was a lot of racism that went on. Palestinians eventually revolted, and the PLO killed a bunch of people and actually went really too far. Like the PLO invaded a Maronite neighborhood called Damour and butchered hundreds of people, raped the women. The Maronites did the same thing, but in a much larger scale in Sabra and Shatila. Sabra and Shatila were two Palestinian refugee camps, And the Maronite paramilitaries, they were called the Phalangists. The Phalangists were essentially Nazi Lebanese. That's what they were. These weren't good Christian folks who were there to fight for Jesus or, to hold up the Bible. That's not what they were doing. They weren't there to advance Christianity or anything like that. These people were basically racists who believed in the superiority of their own race. They had their own idea about their race, that they were, in fact, modern-day Phoenicians. They had this idea of a purely Phoenician society, and their founder, Pierre Gemayel, or was it Pierre or Bashir? I think it was Pierre Gemayel. Pierre Gemayel was actually, when he founded his paramilitary organization, he took inspiration from the Nazis. He actually went to Germany and saw the Nazis and liked what he saw, and so he wanted the same thing in Lebanon. And Pierre Gemayel was essentially a Lebanese National Socialist. So that's what the Phalangists were. Now, the Phalangists, they had a war with the Palestinians, and they also committed atrocities against Palestinians, and also they also committed atrocities against the Shiites as well. And the Shiites, killed Christians as well. PLO also killed Christians. They committed atrocities on each other. But here's the thing: this is when Israel is connected to this whole story. Near the end of the war, the PLO made an agreement. Basically, the PLO got defeated by Israel, and the PLO made an agreement to leave Lebanon. So the PLO said, okay, we're going to leave. All these fighters are going to leave. They're going to go to Syria. They're going to go to North Africa. They're going to go to Jordan, wherever. And they're going to leave. But they wanted to make sure that the Palestinian civilian population in these refugee camps were protected. And so part of the agreement was that these refugees would be protected. So the men left, and what was left in these Palestinian refugee camps were essentially elderly people, women, and children. There were a handful of men here and there, but mainly we're talking elderly people and women and children. It was essentially a maternity ward and an elderly care center. So now all the men are gone. There are no guns in these refugee camps. The people living in these refugee camps were open season sheep for the slaughter. Absolutely, completely defenseless. And the Phalange went into these camps and butchered around 1,000 people. Now they committed rapes. They took Palestinians and they carved crucifixes onto their chests. They sliced people up. They shot people in mass. They did mass executions. It was absolutely horrific stuff. Slaughter, absolute slaughter. Now, the Israeli government was saying, oh, no, we don't know what's going on. Come on, we don't know. And there was there was a huge outcry about what happened. There were a number of Western journalists who really bumped into these camps by accident. They didn't know that a massacre was happening until they got there, and they saw all the bodies. Robert Fisk talks about how he practically, just bumped into this camp. Well, didn't really bump into it, but he went into this camp not knowing that he was going to see bodies, not expecting that he was going to see carnage. And him and his a colleague, his fellow journalist, they went into the camp and they saw all the dead bodies, and it was absolutely horrific. Robert Fisk actually entered one of the camps within minutes after the massacre was done. And the Israeli government, of course, they acted as if they had nothing to do with it. The reality was that they were Israeli soldiers who were around the camps, and they were in the camps watching this happen. In fact, there were Israeli soldiers who were so disgusted by what they were witnessing that there were cases of Israeli soldiers who rescued Palestinians from this stuff, who took Palestinian citizens and civilians and refugees and got them out of the camps, because they knew that if they didn't help some people, they would go absolutely insane from guilt, because guilt is probably the most it's the most sharp feeling that a human being can have. It's the sharpest. It's the feeling that cuts you up inside the most, is guilt. There's nothing else like guilt. And they were Israeli soldiers who knew exactly what was happening. And they were Israeli soldiers who talked about it. And there was one Israeli soldier who said, yeah, the Phalange did this horrific atrocity, but the IDF, we don't do these things. We don't do these things. But the reality is that they watched as it happened. Most of them did. There were some righteous Israeli soldiers who didn't allow this. But here's the thing. When knowledge of Sabra and Shatila happened, and when the reality of Israel's involvement of this, the fact that Israel facilitated this massacre, when it got out to the public, they were literally hundreds of thousands of Israeli citizens who took to the streets of Israel and they protested against the Israeli government. The Israelis were so, and I have to give them credit, they were so ashamed of what their country had done. And they had absolutely every right to feel shame. They were absolutely in the right to feel shame. Think about this. The country that talks about the Holocaust more than any other country in the world, Israel, because the people of Israel are the ones who suffered the Holocaust tremendously, more so than most of the people who suffered in the Holocaust. I mean, the only people I think who suffered as much as the Jews in the Holocaust were the Poles. The Poles suffered just as much as the Jews did. But nonetheless, the state of Israel talks about the Holocaust more than any other government. And when people think of a country in connection to the Holocaust, the first thing they think about is Israel. They don't even think about Poland. They think about Israel. And here is the state of Israel not only supporting a massacre and facilitating a massacre, but here is the state of Israel facilitating a massacre done by Nazis, Lebanese Nazis. So the Israeli populace was so ashamed that they marched in shame by the hundreds of thousands in Israel. Now, I have to give the Israelis credit for this, because when the Palestinians commit terrible things, you don't see Palestinians in the hundreds of thousands marching against the atrocity. And you don't really see this anywhere else in the Middle East. You don't. You know, Saudi Arabia committed some pretty horrible atrocities in Yemen. You don't see Saudis marching in the hundreds of thousands against their government. Turkey has done some pretty horrendous things, facilitating massacres done by ISIS in Syria, specifically the Qasab massacre against the Armenian, the ethnic Armenians living in Syria. Turkey has facilitated a war against Armenia in Nagorno-Karabakh. Over 100 Armenian soldiers were recently captured. Civilians have been butchered. There were 2 elderly Armenian men who were beheaded. And you don't see Azeris saying, you know what, this is absolutely wrong. You just don't see it. You don't see Turks marching in the hundreds of thousands, demanding that their government recognize the Armenian genocide. You don't see that. So I will criticize Israel, the state of Israel, for facilitating the vanquishing of the Armenians. I will criticize Israel for supporting the Azeris. I will do that. But at the same time, I am not going to sit here and act as if Israel is just this big Frankenstein who just does nothing but evil. I won't do that. I have to give credit to where credit is due, and I have to give criticism to where criticism is deserved. The bottom line is this. If I see an Azeri doing something atrocious, I'll point it out. And if I ever see Armenians doing things that are very atrocious, I'll point that out as well. Just like if I see a Serb doing something atrocious, I'll point it out. If I see a Croat doing something that is unjust and inhumane, I'll point that out. If I see a Palestinian doing something good, I'll point that out. If I see a Palestinian doing something evil, I'll point that out. Instead of taking a side, we have to simply look at the good and the evil and recognize them for what they are. Bottom line, end of story. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.